We're here to discuss the Museum of Tomorrow, which is quite a big question and concept and idea. Because of the health situation that you all know about, we've got a few of our speakers joining us from London today. So they wake up quite early to be on board. So Carol C., who is the sales director from Chargeurs, will be moderating the event this morning. We've got Peter Karn, which is the creative director from Med Studio, and Robin Rochford, which is director at Design PM. But first, I would like to let Gustave Gauquelin say a few words on Chargeurs. So, yeah, your turn.
Thank you very much, Aude, and thank you very much for having us as partners for this masterclass. We are obviously very excited to be here with all of you, and I want to thank again Hervé Barbaret, Stéphane Roisin, and the whole France Museums team for organizing this event. Now, of course, as you said, Aude, we are in challenging times because of the pandemic, of course, that we have all experienced over the past few years and months. But we at Chargeurs Museum Solutions, we like to focus on opportunities. So I would like to say a few words on the reasons why we can still be hopeful and excited about the future. The first of these reasons is probably that in spite of tremendous progress that has been made in the field of digital innovation, there is still undisputed and a renewed appetite for the physical, live, and somehow magical encounter one can have with a piece of work or with a magical space, such as the Mobility Pavilion just across the street that was designed by our team from Med Studio. So from this point of view, the future of museums and of cultural institutions is, in our opinion, very bright. The second reason to be hopeful is that with the vast majority of cultural institutions having to close in 2020 and partly in 2021, the global world of tourism has experienced a general reset, with people discovering or rediscovering their next-door museums and people also looking for new destinations as part of their cultural appetite. And for this reason, now is probably the right time to invest in the refurbishment, in the improvement of cultural institutions, and in the renewal of museums. Third reason to be hopeful is that as a response to the COVID pandemic, international and national recovery plans are providing for additional resources for the refurbishment of museums, alongside a strong appetite from the private sector, which we represent, to invest in culture, in museums, and in innovation. And the last reason to be hopeful is that the hybrid model that we have experienced has paved the way for a lot of innovation in the way cultural institutions interact with their audience, interact with people wanting to visit it, and accompany this renewed appetite for culture. So there is a lot to do, and we at Chargeurs Museum Solutions are very excited to be part of this journey. We have today an expertise spanning from master planning to design to fit out and technical solutions to accompany our clients in their efforts to refurbish, improve, innovate in cultural institutions. We have today more than 400 staff that are based in France, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in the Netherlands, and of course here in Dubai. But as importantly, we also have a solid network of very strong local partners that can work with us, help us to think, to design, and of course to implement the solutions that we are providing to our clients. So we are open of course to new clients, open to new partners, open to new talented individuals who would be willing to join us in this journey and in this very exciting adventure. And we are of course open to new ideas, and that's the reason I'm so pleased to be here and to listen to all of you about how can we shape the Museum of Tomorrow. So thank you again very much. Thank you to the whole team. Very excited to have, of course, all of you as part of this masterclass. Peter from Med, Robin from Design PM, Carol as a moderator, and of course, Lina and the whole team. So thank you very much again. Very happy to be with you. And of course, do not hesitate to come to us with your ideas, your projects, your vision for the Museum of Tomorrow. Thank you.
quoi le protocole? Alors, j'ai le droit d'enlever le masque ou pas? Ok, merci. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Hello everyone. Thank you very much, Gustave. I'm very proud to open this Les Rencontres of France Museum right now, and having Chargeurs Museum Solutions team on board for this first part of the day, which is the masterclass. This day is dedicated to the future of museums, to try to share a little bit of ideas about that, to the purpose also of the museums, and how to take stock of many projects having been done in the following years. At this step, we want also to thank you for sure, the Pavillon France, who allowed us to be right there, Expo as well, and all the partners involved in this project. Let's say that we are facing right now unexpected challenges in the museum field, and I would insist on the fact that the key point is adaptation capacity. For sure, we know that we are in a hybrid situation now. You in the room, many people in visio conference, as we say, and this is a demonstration that we need to adapt. We need to adapt our model, and we need to adapt the way we work on museum visitor experience. So right now, it was just a few words to say thank you. I'm glad to have also Mrs. Carol Say, which will be moderating the masterclass, and going further into the way how we can improve the fact that museums are built in the future. Thank you very much.
Carol, it's your turn. You are on full screen here.
Oh. Well, thank you, Gustave and Stéphane, for your apt and inspirational words. Good morning, all from London. As we kick off this morning's masterclass, I would like to first introduce myself. I am Carol C., Sales Director at Chargeurs Museum Solutions, your moderator for the session. As a research scientist by trade, public engagement, communication, and collaboration play a vital role in shaping my daily activities. After many years running a science center in London, I joined a private specialist company where I spent many years honing my skills and experience within the museum industry before joining the Chargeurs family. I have had the privilege to work on many iconic projects, on the clients, consultants, and suppliers teams, working with various project stakeholders all around the world on different subjects. I can thus relate and appreciate all perspectives of a project, from inception to delivery, and understand the importance of collaborative working approach. It gives me great pleasure today to therefore host and moderate this morning's masterclass with our renowned speakers and partner who have taken time out to be with us here. Before I introduce the panels, some housekeeping items. We have audiences who are with us physically and virtually today across different time zones. Regardless of your location, we encourage you to get involved in preparing questions for discussion. For those who are online, please leave your questions on the chat. For those who are at the pavilion, we encourage you to ask them and express your views during the session. Now let's begin. Over the years, we have seen many museum projects becoming larger and more complicated. Clients are pushing the design and content boundaries, and designers are pushing the boundaries of buildability. Projects are also becoming more and more challenging, with programs getting fast-tracked. Visitors' expectations and demands of these experiences are also increasing day by day. Added to that, We observe constant disconnections at various stages of a project cycle, from architecture, scenography, all the way to operations and maintenance of these institutions. And added to that, the challenging time we have been living in the past 24 months and are continuing to do so are showing us that the way we live and work and engage with one another has radically changed. As museums and cultural institutions, we have a new opportunity to shape how we connect with one another. So today, we come together as experts and participants to question how we connect with one another. What is coming together? Each discipline working closely and collaboratively from the very beginning of a project. Vertically integrating knowledge, skills, and experiences, creating opportunities and possibilities to capture the museum visitor experience as a whole. We question the role and function of a museum today, the importance of a brief, definition of a project, what is the essence and spirit, concept of programming, how do we manage the inception phases, the realization of a project up to the point where the museum opens. How do we encourage project stakeholders to work together? No doubt all of you here relate to these questions. Questions we have frequently raised and debated. Today's session is a continuation of that debate. We explore the importance of defining a narrative, exercising adaptability and flexible collaboration, and identifying the audience. Without further ado, it is my honor to present my fellow moderator, Aude, who will be assisting me, and our fellow speakers and experts. First up, we have the founder of Paris-based Atelier Lina Gomez Architecture, Lina Gomez. Having lived in Beirut and echoing her experience there, her work is choreographed as an archaeology of the future. Every project emerges in complete symbiosis with nature. Next up, the man who encourages us all to dream, Peter Karn, Global Creative Director of experiential design agency Met Studio. Peter, with his team, create highly innovative, interactive, and immersive projects that connect audiences with stories. Rochford, Director of Design PM, the man who balances dream and reality. From a career in theatre production, Robbie moved into culture and heritage, bringing a track record of delivering over 30 museum projects in consultancy, client-side, and contracting roles. And finally, we have Stéphane, Deputy CEO of France Muséums. Stéphane has been designing and implementing artistic, tourism-related, and complex cultural projects for over 15 years, both in France and internationally, focusing on strategic heritage programming and planning. Now, Lina, over to you to begin.
Thank you, Carol. Nice to see you here. I think we will start with an introduction of each one's work, also to launch the debate. And I tried also to answer to the different questions that we've been asking ourselves through some of the examples of the work I'm leading in my practice. If I can just have the presentation maybe on. Yes, thank you very much. So my practice is in Paris, and we're around 30 people leading different projects, from cultural to institutional to different like housing buildings, but also like the museum projects are ones that inspire our practice constantly. And the archaeology of the future is a process to kind of think of what we build, how do we project our past into the future, constantly learning from our past experiences to build innovative futures. So what is at stake when we're building a museum, and what can a museum do? So one of the things we try to do is to think about architecture as anchored in its environment, that even if we're implementing concepts from different parts of the world, how can it emerge from a place? How can it talk about a certain context? One of the projects that we had the opportunity to design is the Estonian National Museum. And that's a project that is quite challenging because it's a national museum. It talks about ethnographic collection. And the challenge was how to make it a contemporary platform, a place where the public can engage. And it's not only about like hosting like a collection that talks about history, but can be a platform for cultural exchange and that engages the public, especially at a time today where, as we know, all the young generation is faced with a lot of social media interactions. So we spend a lot of our time in the virtual reality. So how can physical space and architecture be an engaging element in talking about history, in engaging with a site? So it is about transforming a context, and as we saw in the movie that wasn't very fluid, but we can see here actually like this platform that is an ancient, like dismantled ex-military Soviet airfield. And that through the project, through that building, we decided to transform the site actually and to link the museum to that existing platform and to have a building that transforms the whole site. So here architecture is also acting as a land art. It acts on a territorial scale. It transforms its own context as well. So the museum always plays also between monumentality and a capacity to disappear in a context, to really modestly sit and at the same time affirm itself as an identity. It voices culture, it talks about memory, and transforms its context. The museum is not only a shell, it has to evolve through time, it has to be a place where it's alive, it's a cultural incubator where life happens. So it is also about the spaces in between. So through architecture, we try to offer these generous spaces where life can happen between a shop or a cultural place. It's about engagement, so how to engage the public into these large spaces. For example, here we find ourselves in transition between the entry of the building and the exhibition spaces. And it's just a large, generous space that finally got appropriated to become a place of life, of concerts for the Estonians. So really thinking about space as also a possibility for creating new events and for creating culture, like manufacturing culture. It's about a library space and also a place for conservation, for working on an existing collection, for interaction, for telling stories, and building from the past, building from what a culture had produced in a certain past. So how to interact is a main question. And today with the tools, for example, in Estonia, with all the like digital tools, they constitute a major part into creating and actualizing actually historical collection. So we constantly move between like artifacts and historical objects into more interactive ways of bringing these to the public. So educating the public and the young public through such a combination between the actual very much physical world and the virtual one that starts to kind of like combine in one scene. So the museum lives with that context and is also able to change in terms of form, in terms of how it is seen physically in that context through the different weathers. So even if we're thinking from France, we try to adapt to the place itself and to build a continuity with history and to transform a certain territory. And that allows actually a place to be a place of celebration. So as we see here, this Estonian museum, by linking to that airfield, it creates an activation platform. And that was actually a concert that was held by Metallica on this airfield. So really transforming this whole building into a public place. But it's also a place where, in a way, imagination can happen. And for example, that was a movie that was done by artists exploring the spaces of the museum, but also exploring unexpected spaces of that building. So here they're really like inside the canopy space, somewhere I wouldn't have imagined that they would just film something here. So space is important, is an engagement actually for creativity, for culture. And as we see here, it starts to get one to imagine different scenes, interact, talk about culture, experience moods. It is also talking about history, but also maybe sometimes political statements, like this building for a museum of revolution in Kiev, where it's about commemorating this whole revolution that happened in Ukraine, like in that occupied Maidan Square. So the building is really a public platform that is appropriated and becomes a place for the city itself. It's a place for elevation as well, like this is, for example, a building that we did that is actually a museum without any collection. It's a museum of creation. It's around the creation history as it is, of course, stated in Islamic verses and religion. And we had the exercise to do this museum just thinking about the creation as an experience itself and building around that in space. So this kind of oasis space that gets us into the creation of the universe as a space of interaction and immersion that one is driven into. So it's a succession of experiences, of engaging experiences that the community gets through. And it's also a combination between daily life and immersion. Conservation is a challenge, and here, for example, in that project, we did like a new typology of museum where it's about archiving, but at the same time, like an interactive archiving space for a collector. And it's about actually how to let the public curate the exhibition. So here the public walks around these ramps, and as they open the storages, they start to curate the scenography of the place, but also discover the narrative, discover the history of the collection that is put. So it's a bit also a questioning about the history of the evolution of the museum, and that's something that we're really interested in, how to like learn about how the museum evolved through time and kind of come up with a new typology that also combines the storage, but also like allows the landscape to be an exhibition place. And always thinking about a building that is sustainable, that can live through time, that is able to consume the least energy, because as we know, museums are highly like consumers of energy because of the collection that you need to sustain. So how do you also make a sustainable, durable, ecological building? It's also a place of healing. Like this is a museum that we did in Shenzhen, a competition that we participated in. And here, for example, this is a hill that was big quarry of the site, of the city of Shenzhen. So the whole city of Shenzhen was built out of that site. And the idea is to bring the museum as in continuity of nature, as a healer of nature, to talk about land art. And here we see Andy Goldsworthy installation. And having the museum express that tight relationship with nature, but also with tradition and ways of thinking about like traditional modes and customs. So these are like this kind of light papers that sit on this kind of forest of columns that talk about the forest that was once present here. And modernizing all this actually allows us also to move into the smaller scale, and we move into scenography that allows us actually through the light and through the way we display the works to talk about know-hows. And this is an exhibition for master artists, French master artists that were exhibited in Japan and in Tokyo, and to give a culture around that. And this is another exhibition in Tokyo. So subliming the works, but also trying to narrate them and engage the visitor through the works that we display, moving from the large scale of a museum into the minute work of every collection that is exhibited, and sometimes working with immaterial, let's say, collection or experience, like this installation with water. And this work inspires like works that are non-museums. Actually, a museum work is really like a frame of thought that allows to bring a new language into other actually typologies, like housing, for example, and thinking about housing that could be as engaging as a museum in a city. And this is a building in Beirut, and here drawing just the parallel between a space and the scenography again. And this is also for master artists that were exhibited in China, and talking about the culture of a place like this. This is in Beijing, very close to the Cité Interdite, and it's about these kind of different doors that open up for new world. So maybe it's also an essential extraordinary to build a museum. Thank you very much.
Carol, you have the mic.
Now we bring Peter to present his work. Thank you, Lina.
Thank you, Carol. And good morning, everybody. Apologies we can't be there in person. So yeah, I'd just like to, after that very inspiring presentation from Lina, thanks very much, Lina, just say a few words about Met Studio and the work that we do at Met Studio. So we are a experiential design agency based in London. And our primary area of focus is creating interactive and immersive visitor experiences. So in essence, what we do, it can be a very, very complex endeavor, and I think we'll get into detail throughout today's session on the complexities of that. But bringing it down to something very, very simple, what we do effectively is we take stories and we look at audiences. And our practice is to look at meaningful ways we can connect these two things. In terms of our creative process, we're very, very interested in the idea of creating emotional engagement with the experiences that we design and that we build. And this initially it comes from quite a rigorous research and analytical process. But what we always try and do is define the essence and the spirit of the project in a single vision or a big idea. Once we've defined that, we then engage our design practice in terms of design process and drawings and technology and how we physically express this big idea. But I think this is quite an important point to make in terms of what we do, and that this hourglass process of research and definition, so that the ideas that we create are always relevant for our audience and for our story. And just to show some examples of this, this is a fairly small scale project that we did, which was for the Manchester Museum, and it was an exhibition all about climate change and all about the future that our planet faces and the past that we've experienced that is now creating our future. And the climate change story has been told from many different perspectives over many different years, and our client was very keen here that they wanted an everyday context that people from Manchester were familiar with, but they also wanted a positive outcome on the story. So we actually did a lot of research with our client and looked at various different stories. And one of the things that we discovered was the Manchester peppered moth, which is the image that you see here. And the story behind the peppered moth is that originally the moth was almost white in color, as the image that you see on the right. And it was this way in terms of the moth camouflaging itself to indigenous buildings within Manchester that were mainly limestone buildings to evade predators. During the Industrial Revolution, the moth actually evolved to be almost black to camouflage itself with the emission-stained buildings of the city. What's happening now, however, is the moth is now slowly turning white again as the city cleans itself up. Now, it's a very simple story, this, but it acted as a very, very powerful metaphor to create an icon for the exhibition, looking at the past and about our industrial past, but also looking at our sustainable future. So we use this as our big idea to actually create the topography of the entire experience in the exhibition, creating a sculpture within the lobby of the museum itself, but then also using this positive, negative, past and future iconography to actually split the exhibition in two, allowing the visitor to explore the past and explore the future. I explore the climate issues that we face, but also explore solutions for our future of the dark and the light. So looking at that in more detail as well as in terms of visitor engagement, a very, very low budget and temporary exhibition that this was created. It didn't have a huge budget. So we used very simple interactive ideas where visitors could actually turn the space white by adding solutions as little comment cards and sketches and ideas to the space. So they themselves actually took an active role in shaping the exhibition's content. The result of this was, from a very small, low-budget exhibition, was a huge amount of global press. Vivienne Westwood was very heavily involved in promoting the project in terms of her environmental angle, in terms of her campaigning, but also simple things like members of the public getting into the spirit of the brand and iconography of the story that we were telling by exploring this idea of positive and negative, that one doesn't exist without the other. And this is a new way of looking at climate change issues for the future. So moving on, another relatively small project, and this was for the charity Sight Savers. And we worked with them very, very collaboratively to create an experience that was to raise awareness of the eye disease of trachoma, which affects a lot of developing countries, particularly Central African nations. And trachoma is, I won't go into too much detail, but it's a very unpleasant eye condition that causes scarring of the eyelids that actually causes you to blink yourself blind. So over a prolonged period of time, every time you blink, you're one step closer to blindness. This is an awful condition, but it's something that can be cured with sanitation and antibiotics. And Sight Savers had a global campaign to raise awareness and funding to completely eradicate this condition. So what we actually did is co-create an experience with Sight Savers, the charity, whereby we commissioned artists to create digital artworks within a space, but we created facial tracking technology that registered visitors' blinks, so that every time they looked at an artwork and blinked, it would ever so slightly destroy a piece of that artwork. So this is a very good example of that big idea being expressed through relevant means, in this case, facial recognition and digital technology. And the idea that the very, very simple exhibition displayed these artworks digitally, but the cameras gradually tracked the blinks and then permanently destroyed these art pieces. To create these very, very abstract images that were physical or visual representations of sight loss and of trachoma. And at the end of the exhibition, the artworks were auctioned off, or the abstracted artworks were auctioned off as artworks within themselves to represent the condition. I just want to run a very quick video on this as well.
Sightsavers set out to raise awareness of the leading cause of preventable blindness in the world. Trachoma. The disease has been tragically robbing people of their eyesight for thousands of years and is currently considered to be a public health issue in over 40 countries. Scarring from repeated infections can cause the eyelashes to turn inwards, so they scrape painfully against the eye with every blink. Sightsavers' mission is to eliminate trachoma in the countries where it works by 2025. They know where it is, and they know how to treat it. But eliminating it is going to require a massive increase in awareness. Imagine if every time you blinked, you were one step closer to blindness. This is Blink. Blink uses a series of digital images from award-winning photographers, including Nick Knight and the late David Goldblatt, to help demonstrate how trachoma deteriorates vision to blindness. Using tracking cameras to capture the blinks of each visitor, the digital images were destroyed pixel by pixel with each blink. The exhibition captured over 150,000 blinks from visitors, with many returning to see the ever-changing process, until every photograph was blank, never to be seen again. Blink kicked off a wider Sightsavers campaign that went on to raise over £2 million. This exhibition acts as one of the final steps to ending trachoma for good. The end is in sight.
Yeah, so I think that's a very good example of the kind of visitor engagement that we're talking about. But scaling up from that, this was another project that we recently completed in Singapore. And this was a project funded by the Singapore government, the Prime Minister's office, to actually retell the historical story of Singapore, going back 1,000 years, to actually redefine its history. So it was quite an iconic project. And this was a project that was creating a free experience for citizens and visitors to Singapore to experience, to actually talk about real Singaporean culture, the title being From Singapore to Singaporean. So again, scaling up from the examples that we've shown, we used very immersive techniques to create a very physical experience that didn't require a lot of traditional museography and text and objects and collection, but more actually create immersive theatrical stories in spaces. So by using falling water, by using live actors on stage to recreate battles, by using digital projection, three-dimensional overlays and moving scenery, we create these very, very immersive theatrical stage sets that tell stories. And we move through the ages. So we show warring dynasties of 1,000 years ago to modern Singapore being created literally around the visitors by using 360-degree projection and a moving platform that visitors then sit on. But then moving forward, we can then actually close the visitors' senses and actually turn off all of the audio-visual effects and actually have a completely dark space with a very, very subtle audio story. And this is where we again form a different emotional connection with visitors, where we're talking about the darker material, about the Japanese occupation of Singapore during the Second World War. And then finally, again, forming that emotional connection with the visitors. The finale of the experience was a room where we actually handed visitors umbrellas and made it rain in the space. As I'm sure everyone's aware, it rains a lot in Singapore, so an umbrella is a very essential item. But what we created here was a recreation of the founding father of the nation of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, and his funeral in 2015, where the entire population of Singapore stood out in the rain for his funeral as a mark of respect. And this formed this really, really emotional moment that was the finale of the exhibition. And again, it's not just about technology, it's about that story and how we position that and how we form that emotional bridge between the story and the visitor. So this allowed us just to create some incredibly moving and memorable theatrical moments within the experience. And memory is an important word here. And I think this is a term that Lena used as well. It's about building memories within places that allow these emotional connections to stories that people remember and then learn from. And then they can go out into the world and maybe view things ever so slightly differently. And it's that transformative effect of experiences that really interests us. And then finally, this is a project that we recently completed, working with a very, very large collaborative team that spanned the entire globe, from New Zealand to the United States and Europe, and then, of course, working under the guidance of the wonderfully passionate and creative team from Expo to actually create the experience within the mobility pavilion at this Expo. And one of the interesting things about this project is it's very much a mix of all of the tricks of the trade. We work with movie production studio Weta Workshop out of New Zealand to create these incredible theatrical sets and sculptural pieces. We work with, obviously, Foster's architect, who created the incredible building that the experience sits within. But then also researchers in terms of looking at the story in all of its aspects, in terms of the outfits of the characters, their personalities, the narrative of mobility that goes from footsteps out of Africa 40,000 years ago through incredible Arab scholars to the foundation of the UAE itself, but then looking at global mobility, digital mobility, but then exploring beyond that into space and into the future through the dreams and the ideas of children. So a project that was a kind of Hollywood movie in its scope and in its reach, and also in its cast and its the people that produced it. But again, it always comes back to an emotional connection with the visitor. All of these incredible sets and designs that were created were all coming from this very emotional storytelling place. And one of the amazing things about this project was, again, the incredible people that we work with, but the variety of craft that was involved in actually creating this movie-like cinematic experience that visitors walk through. But all of the projects that we've shown have one thing in common, and that's that they come from a single spirit and a single vision, and then they use various medium to express that single vision in a meaningful and emotional way to an audience. So thank you very much.
Carol, are you still with us?
Yes, thank you, Peter, for the display of your creativity and ingenuity. Next, we have Robin, the man who has the big task of balancing project vision and reality. Over to you, Robin.
Thanks, Carol, and good morning, everybody. So I've been really lucky to work with
lots and lots of really inspirational, creative people, just like Peter, just like Lena. But my role is very much focused on the project management of these amazing projects. It's about, I think, allowing that dreaming time, but also finding the right moment to take those dreams and turn them into reality. So this morning, I'm very briefly going to describe some of my experience. I'm then going to talk very quickly about how good project management can make a really key contribution towards these projects. And then we'll talk a little bit about Design PM and what we do and how we can help with these projects. There was a nice theme that Lena mentioned earlier around the evolution of a museum project. This is a project that I was the project director for. As Carol mentioned earlier, I've had lots of different roles within the museum sector. I've worked directly for the client. I've also worked for specialist contractors, and I've worked as a consultant, as I do now with Design PM. So this project was one that was actually implemented by Beck, a contractor. I was the project director, and we refurbished about 20 galleries over 2 different phases. Now, it's interesting to see a very, very traditional building, which is approximately 150 years old, and it contrasts hugely with this project. This is the King Abdulaziz Centre for World Culture in Dhahran, which was an Aramco project, also known as the ITHRA project. So I worked in the briefing stage for this project back in 2007, 2008. The Natural History Museum in the UK was commissioned by Aramco to put together the brief for a particular gallery. It was initially known as Gallery 4, but it ended up being known as Arabian Journeys. And it was really about the natural history of the Arabian Peninsula. But what a contrast when you look at those images on the right-hand side to what I sometimes describe as a designed environment, which is really the more contemporary museums. But it really reflects the technology of the day. The previous image of the National Museum of Scotland in a 150-year-old building, it's really a repository for artifacts. But then we come right up to date with the exhibition design, which was done by Atelier Bruckner, and we see some of the technologies involved to create those really fluid and dynamic shapes within the gallery. Back 200 years back in the past again, this is the Nelson Navy Nation Gallery at the National Maritime Museum in London. I worked inside that team, and again, I was involved in putting together the brief, which was working with the different teams within the museum to understand their part of the project through the curation, through the academic side to an extent, and then through the learning team, through the outreach team, to bring that together with the fantastic 200-year-old collection and to create a brief which was then used to go out and launch a design competition, which Cass and Mann then became responsible for the fit out. So it's a very traditional gallery, but it's done in a really nicely contemporary manner. The next project is a couple of images from the Sheikh Abdullah Al Salam Cultural Centre, which was an enormous project that I delivered as a project director, working for a contractor. And it's very artifact heavy, but it's interesting that all of those artifacts are replicas. They're all models. So whilst the project is on a huge scale, 22,000 square meters, I was involved in the management right down to the very, very detail of the sculpture on the right, which was known as the Brilliant Biodiversity Sculpture. There's approximately 50 individually sculptured animal models. So it was a really interesting process to go through there, a creative process, but one which had to be tied to quality control and also a contractual process. This is another image from the same projects. It's quite similar in a way to the National Museum of Scotland. Similar themes: transport, aircraft, high-tech, interactive exhibits on robotics with science themes, but everything absolutely brand new and integrated into a new building. So a little on project management. What does this guy do? So he's got a lot. He's got a lot to do. How can he do it most effectively for museum projects? He actually looks quite calm in a way, as much as there's lots going on. But once we start seeing all those links between all those different parts that are moving around, all the different stakeholders, I guess he's getting a little bit less calm now. So we can apply process. We can apply PMI process, APM process, Prince2, P6. But actually, I think what museum projects need is really to recognize that it's the project. It's that single vision that Peter referred to that has to be central in that process. The unifying vision, as we refer to it sometimes. It's what we try to really focus on at Design PM. And we think through a blend of our experience, our empathy for the projects, that we can do it very, very successfully. So we can bring together the needs, the different pace. Sometimes we describe ourselves as translators because we understand the very, very different motivations that a client may have. We understand the very different motivations that an external stakeholder, like an external funder, may have. The design teams, the architects, the supply chain, the internal stakeholders at the different institutions. So we bring it all together. We can balance all those different elements. Catalysm as a catalyst is an important word at Design PM because we can see how to make something happen. The dreaming time is really central. That's the first thing that happens. But how do we actually put a map in place to achieve the project? So we can catalyze that, and we can try and bring that collaborative, calming spirit to a project. So that brings us to Design PM. We are a trusted partner of client and creative teams. And it's really important that we bridge the management gap between design and construction. There are a lot of traditional project management approaches which I think perhaps too quickly make it very, very scientific. And we don't think that is appropriate for museum projects. Of course, we need to create these frameworks to control the cost, the quality, the program, but really we're championing that creative vision right at the heart of these projects. So the services, project definition, so we work with clients to help them to articulate their briefs. Procurement is a key one for such unique projects. There are sometimes some very traditional approaches to procurement which have a place, but we like to work with clients to try and explore different options, those options which will best fit the creativity in the projects, the timing in the projects. Supervision of graphics, models and media, it's a specialism because they are in themselves further pieces of design, further creative processes. So our team really understands the pace of those elements and how we can synchronize when they're going to be ready to come in with a more traditional building project. So we work across all of the different project stages. We use down at the bottom there the REBA stages, and we talk about work in initiation, implementation and operation. So those services from the previous slide will fit across the entire project cycle. So our team, we're a team of 30 people now, and we're continuing to grow to support our clients all around the world. We've got a headquarters in London, we've got teams deployed permanently in Riyadh, We've also got teams in Abu Dhabi for live projects at the moment. And the empathy that we have for these projects comes from the different backgrounds within our team. So we have people who started out in the industry as designers. We've got team members who were focused on content and interpretation. We've got team members who've been working inside museums, alongside the project management, the cost management, and the site management elements. Within the UK, we have within that team a vast experience of working with all of the large national institutions and also lots of other institutions. We're not just the sort of London-centric institutions. There's so much out there. There's so much to learn from the other institutions and the richness that gives into our project experience. Quality is absolutely central. If a museum selects an artifact, it's selected the artifact for its visual impact. So everything that we need to help to create around that needs to be of the very highest quality, because we can't dilute that experience of the artifact. With respect to Design PM's projects in the Gulf region, I've just got a few examples to talk through very quickly. It's interesting that I think Lena has also picked up on the evolution of projects and the use of the landscape increasingly. This is an image from a very interesting project called Desert X, which Design PM project managed working with the Royal Commission for Alula in 2020. It was 14 large-scale artistic interventions set into the landscape. Fascinating fast-track project, working with lots of different stakeholders, artists. This project was one that Design PM was the project manager, the supervision consultant for. It's the Ahmed Al Jabeer Oil and Gas Exhibition in Kuwait, which was a project for the Kuwait Oil Company. We often talk about how exhibitions can work together with architecture, and this building actually was a very interesting and I think very successful example of where the narrative of the exhibition has actually driven the architecture. Visitors would come in, they would go down into a basement area as if they were being immersed in the rock strata of where the oil is produced. They would then go up to the top of the building in a lift to look across the different oil fields, and they would come back down. So the whole building really supported that narrative. Huge amount of very, very technical integration. The image on the lower left-hand side was of an exhibit called the Oil Drop. So the concept behind the Oil Drop was that visitors would be shown the volume of oil that would be produced in a second by the Kuwait Oil Company. So there is a vast tank full of liquid, which on a timed basis drops all of that liquid in a very, it's very dramatic. And of course, tons and tons and tons, which had to be accommodated within the building. In fact, the oil drop exhibit sits above a projection table. So there was a lot of technical integration to make sure that the building and the loads and additional structural pieces were put in to make sure that what was happening downstairs in the basement wasn't affected by the vibrations. This is another project in Kuwait that Design PM had the role of project manager and supervision consultant on. It's the Al Salam Palace, which is a project for the Emir Diwan in Kuwait. It was a restoration of one of the Kuwaiti palaces, which had actually been damaged in the war with Iraq many decades earlier. So it was great that the building could be brought back to life and house lots of different interactive exhibits. Another image from the Sheikh Abdullah Salam Cultural Centre. Design PM, again, were in the role of project management, supervision, quality control, representing the client. I think the slide order has just changed. Apologies, I'll just get back to where we were and we'll just move on to the final slides. This image is of the Diriyah Gate development outside of Riyadh. In 2020, Design PM was commissioned by the Diriyah Gate Development Authority to help to write briefs for 6 large-scale museum projects that will go within development. It's a development on an unprecedented scale, and we've actually been fortunate enough to work again with Diriyah Gate. So we've got a team of 16 project managers that are embedded to help and support DGDA through the management of currently 10 cultural assets that we're working on. This last image, and then I'll hand back to Carol, is another project in Saudi Arabia, which is the Noor Riyadh, which was a festival of light art, which is part of the Riyadh Art Programme. It picks up on that theme of what is a museum? Does a museum need a building? How can we activate external spaces to create these experiences? And I think it's a really interesting one. You know, it's a really interesting time within the UAE, within Saudi Arabia. I think the form of museums is really being challenged and it's really being driven. So, you know, we're fortunate to work a lot in the region, and that's all from me for now. Thanks, Carol.
Thank you, Robin, for assuring that dreams do come true. Finally, we have Stéphane Roisin, who is the expert on strategic heritage programming and planning. Over to you, Stéphane.
Hello, Carol. Hearing from those speeches coming from Robin, Peter and Lena, this morning I would like to insist on one simple message, which is the following. I really think that many of the shortcomings of project museums are not coming from the lack of resources, talent, ambition, even strategy. It's coming from just asking questions from the really beginning. Tackling the issues, pointing out the equilibrium, the balance between politic stakes, cultural ones, artistic, creativity, finance, whatever. And I really think that it could be interesting to share the fact that thinking about that, it's an investment, a key investment for the project. When you start by considering this, as you say in the UK or US, strategic planning, there is no word in French about that, actually. You're saying that it's just a way to consider that from the really start, nothing is written, but it has to be. And at this step, you need to consider that there is no leader in the project. For sure, many projects want to go fast in architectural, in design, even if there are some huge talents in this field. But it is very tricky to go too fast in the architectural proceedings and thinkings. Some others could say, okay, you can find a super expert. He will do it. Maybe. But the key thing is that the project owner has himself to find this balance. To accept it very precisely. Let's say that it's not just a brief. it's not just a list of specifications. For sure, it's important. It's finding the, I would say it in French, le fil rouge. The core of your projects, what cannot be taken apart at the end. I want to pay tribute at this step for the people here in the room, because concerning the Louvre Abu Dhabi, this phase was a very long process to invent this balance, to write the story of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, and then to make it sustainable. Sustainable both for sure for technical issues, but also in the concept, to resist to the time, having the capacity to accept new artworks, to be evolutive. Hence the fact that this strategic planning is an investment. At this step also, Carol, I would like to share the fact that I think this is not a question of, strictly speaking, collections or visitor experience, because it is a topic, or anything else. It is a question of finding the connections, finding how to invent the connections between artworks, the connections between artworks and the building, or the future building, and the connections between the artworks, the building, and the visitors. So there is no evidence, there is no obvious way to find this. It has to be invented. And what is the priority? Is it the connection between the building and the artworks, or is it towards the visitors? At this step also, I wanted to share the fact that it's not just the start of the project that has to be like this. This planning. It's a process. It's a process starting from the early start of the project, but continuing for sure in the implementation phase, but when the museum is opened. And we would also like to share here that making the link between this expertise from the early beginnings of the projects and the responsibility to make the building being sustainable is the core mission of France Museums. So it's also a fact that when we go back to the very start of this masterclass, which is how to I would say to put the visitor experience forward into museums, I would like to sum up and saying, okay, there is no opposition between this visitor experience and the classic way to understand museums through academics, etc. It's just a way to reinvent the museums and to consider that these origins of the museums have been to, yes, precisely this, to be inspiring. So, yeah, that's it for me at this step, Carol.
Thank you, Stéphane. Thank you all for the insightful and inspirational presentations, which demonstrate the panel's creativity and ingenuity in creating museums, and that together, through collaborative approach, identifying brief, and with the right management, our visions can be turned into reality successfully. Before we commence the second part of the session, to debate what is at stake at creating museums, how do we create memories, emotional connection between the exhibits, physical and digital, and with the audiences, the importance of essence and spirit, adaptability, and the importance of leadership. We shall now take a break of 10 minutes. During the break, we shall be gathering questions which have been raised in the past hour. As mentioned earlier, we encourage all to get involved. Please leave your questions on the chat for those who are online, and for those who are at the pavilion, please raise them directly. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. So you do have a little break if you like one. There are coffees and teas on the terrace, just on your right when you go through that door. And we will, let's say we'll meet again at 11 for the debate session. Thank you.
baseline, if I'm going to be the project manager. It becomes something to measure against. It doesn't have to be final. It doesn't have to be correct. I would also say it's not essential that everybody agrees, but it's essential to have a starting point. And then when things do evolve, as they must, throughout a creative process, there's something to refer back to so that everybody can agree why things have changed. And I think that sense of having a brief is not new, but perhaps recognizing that there can be some flexibility allows this rethinking, which Stéphane has referred to, because things will continue to change. Everybody's been quite consumed and quite focused on what's been happening internationally over the last 2 years or so. But then there'll be something else. You know, there will be things that are positive, which will influence a brief. So I think it's essential, but yes, it can evolve.
And how, in your expert opinion, balance the fine line between some project leaders using the brief to dictate the end product, as opposed to using it as a framework to develop the project?
Yeah, I think it's true to say that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. One of the projects that I referenced earlier was a project where the brief, in fact, two of the projects, where the brief was very, very defined. The Arabian Journeys Gallery at the ITHRA Centre, when the brief was developed, it was a brief that Atelier Bruckner responded to. The design was quite well defined. The themes were there, but that doesn't always fit with an institution. I think it will depend on who the institution has already within their team, who an institution chooses to work with. You know, the other example I gave of the National Maritime Museum, the brief there was very, very fixed because the parameters were known. It was a reinterpretation of an existing collection. So I guess it was easier to put those constraints in place. The large-scale projects that I've experienced, particularly in the Gulf region, don't have the same sort of constraints because they're very often starting from nothing. So it's exciting to work on those projects because the possibilities are so wide in the first instance, but perhaps too wide sometimes. I think some projects can take a lot longer than everybody hopes they will take, and perhaps that's because there are no constraints initially. So I think, again, if things can be a little bit more defined, I think it will contribute towards the success of projects.
Thank you, Robin. Peter, from a creativity point of view, is a fixed brief better or an open brief?
I think that's probably a red rag to a bull to ask a creative, but I think it's a very, very interesting point, and I think the point made about how the industry is changing, and therefore how briefs and the way we work on projects need to change. I think it's. I always remember my university lecturer Ray always saying to me that one of the scariest things in the world is a blank sheet of paper. And I always remember at the time not agreeing with it, thinking, well, you know, when I look at a blank piece of paper, I see limitless opportunity. You know, I can create anything I want. But I think the more I've kind of worked in the industry, the more I understood what he was saying. Because when there are no parameters and when there's no direction, how do you know what you're doing is in any way relevant or in any way has value? And I think this is a really, really interesting point in that you know, creatives like myself, you know, we always yearn for freedom and wanting to express ourselves. But I think some of the most interesting and innovative projects that I've worked on are the ones where there have been quite clear parameters from the start. But I think the point to make here is that parameters aren't dictatorial in terms of the concept or the design that you're creating. They're more the physical limitations of what you're working within. So do you have a short time frame? Do you have a small budget? You know, is your audience very, very specific? Is your site, you know, a low ceiling or daylit or black box? And I think understanding all of these parameters that you're working with, but then being encouraged to innovate within them, for me, is the secret. So there's almost a dichotomy, a tension between very, very clearly defined physical parameters of a job, but allowing flexibility to explore and to innovate within those parameters. The moment you step outside of those parameters, you're then into the realm of you know, unreality or something that's just not feasible. You might all think, well, this is a really exciting notion, but if it's not possible, it's not of any value. So I think coming back to the blank sheet of paper being something terrifying or an opportunity, I think that's what the brief does. The brief allows you to control what goes on that blank sheet of paper and make sure it's relevant. And I think it's understanding the kind of macro view of it rather than using a brief to micromanage a concept. And I think that's a hard balance to strike. And it doesn't just come from words on paper. I think it comes from relationships with clients. And I think it comes from creatives listening to their clients and their audiences and understanding that we don't have ownership of our projects, our clients do. We're facilitators of their dreams and their intentions and their passions and their drive. We're there to facilitate that. So I think it might be a slightly vague answer, but I think that's what a good brief should do. And it doesn't just come from printed words and specs on paper. It comes from relationships and understanding and listening.
Thank you, Peter.
Carol, excuse me.
That's very, very interesting. I will come back to you, Peter, because I would like to understand what exactly is a brief. You talked about it being the baseline of a project, but what is a brief? So I will come back to you on that. But before that, Lena, I'd like to get your opinion. Do you agree with Peter? Do you yearn for the freedom to create and to design when you are being nominated on a project? Would you rather a client give you a brief to start, or would you just like to start with a blank canvas? What is your preference?
Yeah, thank you, Carol. I think maybe I would disagree with Peter on the last bit. He was saying that we're more facilitators. It happens that as an architect, I'm rather I break the briefs all the time. Maybe it's the way we've been developing projects. I think as a first hand, a brief is very important, of course. I mean, building a museum is a long venture. It's a complex venture, as you're saying, Stéphane. It starts with thoughts, and you have to take the time really to build what is the spine and the spirit of the project that one has to develop. And it's a venture of thoughts of different disciplines that are distilled into that piece of benchmark or first mark, basically, that initiates a long journey of design and thought and construction, but also of a lifetime of a building. So that base point is so important to set up a framework and like the red lines that are quite solid, that we always know what's the purpose of what we're doing as a team, as a multidisciplinary team from different backgrounds. And also to withstand the test of time when we move into design and the operation of a museum. But I tend to think also the briefs are made also to be kind of challenged in a certain way. So I take, for example, the project of the Estonian Museum. The brief of that project was to build the project in a different site. And as architects, we just like went out of the site and reached a different platform. So we had a critical eye on that given brief. Also, the program, for example, of a museum, if I'm talking functionality, always sets the museums to have one entrance, and you have to always do your whole exhibition go through this entrance and go out from the same entrance. And in that National Museum, we created 2 entrances, which was challenging actually for a museum typology, but it allowed also for that building to be open to its environment, but also to be read in different manners. So the exhibition would be read in one like one promenade, but also could be challenged in a different way. So it created multiple narratives of what reading of a collection of history could be. So I think like there's of course not a black and white situation, but I think what's very important is that each of the museum makers are also challengers. Then you can also design a museum that withstand time, that is able to kind of be shaken throughout its lifetime.
Peter, you wanted to say something.
No, I think I completely agree with that. I think more what I was trying to say is that I completely agree that being challenged and challenging is fundamental, because that's the only way something's going to evolve. But I think it's more us understanding, I suppose, the anxieties and the challenges that our clients face in terms of, when they're starting a project. I mean, we start projects in various guises. We've had clients come to us with no brief whatsoever and just saying, we want to do an experience about this subject, and that's it, there's nothing else. We've had other clients come to us who have a very, very prescriptive vision of what they want, and we have to kind of unravel it and unpick it and then build it back up again. But I think what they all have in common is that there's always that anxiety, because they're handing over this brief, they're handing over this vision that they have invested huge amounts of time and effort and passion in, and they're putting it in our hands for us to understand it and do something with it. Whether what we do with it is completely challenge it and break it apart and rebuild it and say, actually, your brief is wrong and it should be over here and it should be this, or it's to say, do you know what, we're really on board with what you want to do, we completely understand it and we're going to develop it. It's normally a little bit of the two, and I think it's that relationship is fundamental, that you're allowed to challenge each other. But I think what is also fundamental is that there are parameters to first of all challenge, but also to innovate within. And I think that does come down to that relationship, and it comes down to listening and understanding and empathizing with the needs of a client and the needs of a project, understanding what the core intention of that project is, so that then every thought that we propose doesn't just come from our own personal objectives of what we personally want to do, which can, take you into the realms of vanity projects and all the others, but they come from the essence of that project and that subject and that audience and that place, whatever it is, And I think that's the point I was trying to make. And I think it is a hard balance to strike, in that you want to create parameters, but you want to allow them to be challenged. And I think it's those tensions within a project that can be very, very healthy and can yield fantastic results.
So coming back to my earlier question, Peter, so would you say a brief is a definition of a project?
I think it's an intention. I think that's what it needs to be. It needs to have clear data in it. So this is the site, this is the time frame, this is the budget, this is the collection, if there is one. You know, so that there are those clear kind of there's data that can be worked with. But I think it's a statement of intention, and I think more about clarifying an essence of a project, an emotional spirit, or you know, there's very other words that are all fairly ambiguous terms. But I think however that can be expressed, to try and communicate the intentions of what is being created that everyone can get on board with. What that does is that slight level of ambiguity in that, I suppose, allows for flexibility in the process, for people to then interpret what is meant by that spirit and come up with solutions that aren't prescribed, that can then evolve and have a life of their own, and then in turn be challenged as the job progresses.
Carol, if I may,
Stéphane,
I wanted just to say that I really think that this brief is also a way to indicate what is clearly the strategic bias of the project owner. And it is key to say what it is involved behind. What's the purpose of the project? And if it is not said precisely, it would be done 10 years after, and it would cost 10 times what it could have been at the really beginning. Okay? So it was just a way to say that for sure there are some projects perfectly clear on that fact, on that stake, but most of them are not going on this path, on this strategic bias. And second, en français, I would say the parti pris. What is the parti pris? What is your aesthetics? What is your the feeling you want to have? Not saying how you want to do it. It has to be done by the creative part. But what's the emotion you want to have at the end? And also, in this strategic bias, going back to the start of the discussion about how to put for the visitor experience stake, I would say how, yes, you want to put the visitor experience into your museums. Is it just one aspect from another, or is it key? And I think right now that we, particularly in Europe, even there are some much more modern ways to make museums elsewhere. We have to be very humble on this, saying, okay, how we push the visitor experience, how we make the new link between academics and curators and designers or whatever, and that has to be said.
Just to pick up on that, I think like probably like also a brief is about asking questions, asking the right questions. Because when you're like initiating these questions, then you're engaging immediately. You're engaging the whole team into trying all together to find the right coherent answers to these very precise questions that instate the strategic thinking of a client and of their ambitions of why they want to create that museum. And we sometimes in briefs, we tend to kind of receive briefs where there is kind of a very specific answer. But I feel like when it's too fixed as an answer, it raises a lot of doubts. And then it blocks also the project process. Think like what kind of questions actually you can ask that could also reflect the times that we are living in. A museum in a way is also an expression of a zeitgeist, of a period of time that we are living, and that in a way instills in a cultural incubator all these kind of energies that we're living, and that a mécène, a patron, is able to kind of take and lead into a space, which is really extraordinary as as a typology.
Robin.
Thanks, Carol. Yes, I think we need to recognize that creating a brief can be very, very difficult. It can be very challenging and perhaps intimidating for teams that have not produced a new museum project before. It can be quite a daunting task to actually commit something very, very early to say, this is what it's going to be. So I think benchmarking is really important. I think influence is okay. To pick up on Lena's point, I agree that the brief shouldn't dictate and say, well, this is it, because it doesn't leave space for the creative process. But I think it can contain influences. I think there's nothing wrong with referring to what has been done, referring to things that we think are successful, and actually having the realization that it's okay to say, well, we don't know 100% right now, but we like this, and we like this. Okay, why do you like this? Well, this particular aspect of this. Okay, so maybe put that in the brief so that the creative team start to understand on a more emotional and creative level what you as a client think is going to be successful.
Peter.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Carol. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I remember when we were working with the team at the Expo and had lots and lots of conversations about defining the narrative and defining the story. And obviously they were so passionate and so invested in the project. But they were very, very good in terms of keeping things flexible and having that relationship. But I also remember that there were times when I remember them telling us, because they were working with many, many teams, obviously creating lots of pavilions at the Expo. And they would say that they would mention a thing in a meeting. I think it was one of them said, oh, we were in a creative workshop with the agency and we mentioned robots. And we said, oh, yeah, maybe we could do robots. And then the week later, when the agency came back, everything had robots in it. It was kind of robot, jumping robots, dancing robots, robots on bicycles, and all of this kind of thing. So I think I think it does come back to, it's not just the words that you say or the words that are on paper. It comes from that sort of, that relationship you have with your client, because people say things all the time. When you're in workshops and ideas come into your head and thoughts come into your head, and they can be arbitrary or they can be meaningful. And I think to Lena's point, it's allowing people the flexibility to explore them and understand them, rather than being prescriptive, rather than just, oh, well, they said robots, so let's give them lots of robots. Our job is to interpret what they say and think, well, is that relevant for the project? Go a layer down. Is that relevant to the spirit of this project? Is it relevant to the story, to the place, to the audience? If they said robots, and were they serious, or were they just spitballing when they said robots? And I think that's our job, is to allow our clients flexibility as well to express themselves and say, well, maybe it could be this, and what about this, and what about that? And for us to sort of interpret that and deconstruct it and turn it into something that we feel is relevant to the project that can then elevate it as well. So I think for me, it comes back to a relationship and a dialogue that starts with a brief but then evolves. I think coming back to Robin's point as well.
Carol, I do have a question.
Peter.
Sorry, Carol. I would be interested to know, for, of course, the all panelists here, have you seen the definition of your museum evolving through your career and experiences, through the briefs you received or the competition you answered to, is a museum still what we think it is or it was, or is it changing? I was interested in your different presentations by the thing that, for example, a museum can be a place to meet, to shop, to dance, to sing, not only to see collections or artwork pieces. What is the evolving definition you see in the conversation you have with your with different project leaders or stakeholders? I don't know who want to start. Maybe Lena, because you are here.
Yeah, that's a very nice question. Actually, it's a beautiful one because it's true. Like throughout, I mean, the 20 years of work on such programs, I've seen it evolve, and I've seen also that the museums more and more become places of experimentation, like cultural incubators, but also places where one could experiment. We talk about digital installations or immersive experiences relatively to exhibitions, education places. They're places where we discover the past, but also project into the future. They're inherently public spaces where people meet, but also kind of imagine the future. And pushing that further into that like perspective maybe allows us to get closer to what a museum of the future could be. So there is a sense of also immateriality that is rising in museums. Like a museum is also has a platform somewhere in the immaterial world. I saw, for example, one of the museums, which is this archive that we're working on and that is dug into the landscape, started with a digital platform. So it does also has its complete echo with the collection and discovery of the collection and interaction through the digital platform, but also echoed in an extremely physical place. So you have this kind of tension that is more and more present. Another thing that I notice in the briefs is sometimes in some places, for example in China, there is a strategy of building museums in every city. Every 250,000 inhabitants have to have a museum or something like this. It's like really kind of a cultural vision for the country, which means also that museums will be built very fast. So they have to be done very fast. So the question of what are we building, why are we building that museum is really here at stake. So we get, for example, briefs here where there's no collection or there is no content actually for the museum. So in a way, as architects, I find myself really trying to kind of imagine how the experience of that building could talk about the culture of China, of Shenzhen, of a city, and thinking about space as actually the narrative of a context. And that is quite interesting and very challenging as well. So what is the content actually? What does it contain, the museum? Public, culture, experimentation. So what it contains is challenged today, I think.
Just quickly, let me go back to what I was saying, is the fact that the museum is not a box. So I'm saying it to an architect, but it's not a box. It's not a bunker. It has to be highly opened. Second, we see some acceleration through the extraordinary context today of two long-term trends, which are the incorporation of technology, multimedia, etc. And second, the coexistence between the so-called permanent collection and the other aspects of the museums. So talking about the permanent collections, we can say that there is no permanent collection. There is a place where there are some long-term presentations or mid-term presentations, but there is no permanent one. So the question behind is to make some continuity between this part, which is the bone of the museum, and other aspects which are changing very fast and being a bit more experiential. going back to the technology, the multimedia, I think the big question right now for the museums is to see how much it's not a gadget, but it could enhance the visit. It could bring the collection beyond, being more having capacity to understand it for people not being a scholar. And last thing at this step also, to insist on the fact that we have to be humble on one point, which is that many museums are at the end made for very for people like you in the room or in the YouTube channel. I mean, smart, knowing things, traveling, whatever. But it's 20% of the population. So let's face it, how we can extend this 20%, let's say, to 30% or 40%. And that's going back to the initial question, which is how the museum is redefining itself and how we can make in the brief the fact that one core goal is to tackle, let's say, 50% of the population. That could be interesting to go in this path.
Thank you, Stéphane. Robin, you wanted to add something?
Thanks, Carol. I think the big shift that I've seen, and this isn't necessarily just a shift in my career, but it's a shift over decades and decades. I think the shift is around the direction of information flow. I think traditionally museums had said to visitors, well, if you come here, we will give you information. And I think that has a resonance with what Stéphane has said around the limited percentage of visitors that perhaps are interested in that type of information transfer, which can be very didactic, it can be quite traditional, it can be perhaps a little bit too academic for visitors. I think the shift I've seen in more modern institutions, and particularly Lena, where there isn't necessarily a collection, the shift there, I think, is that those institutions are actually welcoming visitors to bring their information, to bring their opinions, so that the museum becomes more about a mixture and a melting pot of the different influences, so that it becomes a destination for, yes, learning, but also just to experience, the interactivity with other types of information. So I think that's how I would articulate the way things have moved.
Peter.
Thanks, Cara. Yeah, I think Robin's point's a really interesting one, and that's something that we've also noticed. And I think, again, it comes back to Lena's point about this cultural incubator. I think what's also happening as well is museums' relationship with time seems to be changing. And I think, because obviously in museums you get different forms of time. You get deep time, which I suppose is an absolute, where you can look at the geology of planet Earth and how glaciers form formations and how mountains form and volcanoes, etc., which is an absolute. But then you get time in terms of people's attitudes, and I think particularly when it comes to collections, I think this is something that UK museums are going through at the moment, that modern audiences are looking at collections within museums in a completely different light. They're seeing colonialism and they're seeing imperialism in collections. And I think museums are taking on board changing attitudes in terms of how they look at the past, but then in also creating experiences that allow views into the past, but through the lens of the present, and then glimpses into the future. So you can show in a museum time as an absolute, but you can also see it as an attitude. And I think technology plays a part in terms of forums and interactivity, allowing people to share their own thoughts and voices and ideas, either through exhibits or through social media platforms in the digital realm, which I think is a really fascinating landscape to explore. But I also think it's allowing museums to be permeable and allowing visitors to come and view what they see in a museum, but then also look at it within the wider context of their lives and their communities and their regions and then the world as well. And I think what is really interesting are those changing attitudes towards past and present that museums are now exploring a lot more. And I think as designers, we're really interested in exploring ways that we can facilitate that.
Thank you so much, Peter. We've talked a lot about relationships with project owner, relationships with the audiences, exhibitions and buildings, our relationship with the brief, time, exhibits and collections. I'd like to just explore the term relationship a bit further. How do we ensure a coherence in relationship between architecture, scenography, the execution and delivery of the museum when creating a museum? Robin, would you like to start?
Okay, well, I suppose from my perspective and experience, the more successful projects are those where creative teams get to work together very, very early in the process. I'll ask Lena and Peter to talk about their experiences of being those creatives, because of course my perspective is that sometimes I see in a project where that hasn't necessarily gone so well, and quite quickly, in relative terms, across some of these enormous projects, but quite quickly one can see the impact of the disconnect, and quite quickly some of the disconnects become permanent and will ultimately shape what has to come afterwards. So I think the relationship between the client, the creative team, and by creative team I'm including architects and exhibition designers, by forming that early enough and giving it time to develop. You know, time is always a constraint which can lead to less successful outcomes. But I think by allowing the time between the teams to bounce things around with the client certainly before putting shovels in the ground, I think that will form the basis for a good collaboration. I think slightly later in the project, when contractors are involved, when fabricators, specialists are involved, the more successful projects, and this is often constrained by procurement, the more successful projects bring the right specialists into the projects at the right time. And those specialists are creative project participants in their own right. I always try and explain that a museum project, when it's finished, will have been designed 100%. But actually, there's lots of different ways of completing the design early in the process, or a little bit later, or a little bit later, but ultimately they all have to be designed 100%. And increasingly, with the specialisms and the unique exhibits, that piece of design is going to be done by a vendor or a contractor or a producer, someone who isn't part of the initial creative team. So I would say, you know, the best collaborations are where some of those parties are brought into teams earlier than perhaps they might normally be.
Thank you, Robin. Peter, do you agree?
Yeah, I think I do. I think we would always prefer to be working with the overall collaborative creative team from day one, especially with the architectural practices, so that if there is a narrative space, which museums are, that narrative, the DNA of that narrative runs through everything, and that we're all on the same page. Not that we're going to dictate to one another how we do our respective jobs, but I think there needs to be a communication, an interface between those things, so that if we are creating exhibition spaces, the architecture can accommodate them, but also our exhibition can be sympathetic and respond to the architectural vision, and there's that toing and froing. I also think that there does, and this differs from project to project, but there does need to be clear lines of communication and authority on a project. I think that's really important, that you don't just have lots of various parties all pushing their own agendas and going in different directions. I think a consensus on what the vision of the project is fundamental. That comes back to the client and the brief, but clear lines of management and communication, so that everyone knows who they're working for, and that there is essentially an agency in charge of the project that makes the final decision. Ultimately, the final decision is the client, but I think there needs to be that chain of command as well as early collaboration. So I think it comes back to our early point about there needs to be parameters, but there needs to be flexibility and fluidity within those parameters. But we would always champion early collaboration as opposed to bringing parties in later in the process.
Thank you, Peter. Lina, what's your thought as an architect?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I would be provocative a bit here. I think it's important to have a synergy between the different teams, and this is essential. And I think the quality or the competency of every discipline has to be really. I mean, you have to have the best teams in every discipline to have a successful museum at the end. But I do believe that there needs to be leadership, actually, for every stage of the museum development. Leadership when the time, when the brief and the purpose, the spirit of the museum is developed. In the architecture process, again, leadership. In the execution process, leadership. And in the running process, leadership. It's like a guarantee in a way that the vision of that project is reinstated and developed and conserved at towards the end of the project, but also sorry, in the way it's run afterwards. So definitely collaboration is highly important, and the teams have to get along and communicate and listen to each other. But without a leader and the leadership in the process, I mean, the result could become a kind of a compromise. And we, in museums, you cannot compromise. They are highly engaging and highly, we expect high, actually, in museums, institutions, but also spaces. That's why I think that it should be led this way, basically.
Stéphane, do you want to react?
Yeah, quickly. I think you're totally right. Going back to basics, we need a leader for this type of project, because there are some cultural stakes, money, etc. And if there is no project owner, it's the crash of the project in a way or another. Going back to the question of Carol about relationships, I just would like to extend my previous remark about connections, insisting on the fact that, yes, let us see a little bit more of museums as a place where there are connections between artworks, between the building, etc., etc. And connections, yes, between the different contributors of the projects through the project owner. Let's sum it. It's a strictly personal point of view, but I think when you are visiting a museum, you can feel the quality of this connection between the project owner and all the people involved. And you can feel even how was made this dialogue progressively. That's quite interesting to rethink the visit through this type of connections.
Totally, I totally agree. Actually, in spaces in general, if there is a great synergy between the different disciplines and people working in it, you do really feel it in the place. That's totally, it generates the emotion actually of a place.
I would like to open the session. Sorry, Carol. I would like to open the session to the participants as well. We're a bit conscious of time, so just if you want to ask questions, feel free. Yeah. We do have a question, Carol. Sorry.
Vincent from Chargeurs. I want to ask a question related to sustainability. And in the word sustainability, I don't necessarily mean spending less energy or less water, but the perennity of a museum. It is pretty obvious that as an architect, this is a baseline of your work, obviously. And I would say that for White Walls Museum, it is probably an easy thing to do to have a very sustainable museum. Of course, Le Louvre and other museums are eternal in a way. But in a way, I have a bit of a concern in what you said, Stéphane, about the digital and this new world of digital solutions. And we see exhibitions that, quite honestly, when you see them day one, you feel, in a lot of cases, that in 5 years, 10 years, they will be extremely dated. So how do people like you, Peter, probably, and actually all of you in the panel, react to the idea that an exhibition museum, an experience museum, has to be as eternal, in a way, or as sustainable as the building is?
Can I respond to that one first? There's often a desire within project teams to use the very, very latest technology, to use something that no visitor will have ever seen before. And I think it's those types of experiences that can paradoxically date more quickly than sometimes the more simple applications of technology. You know, technology is embedded in our lives through the phones in our hands. It's not really, it's not so new anymore. So I think the more successful applications of technology now are moving beyond the technology for the sake of technology because it's something new and impressive. And I think through utilizing technology, which of course is present, but is a little bit behind the scenes, it will foreground the really timeless ideas, the really creative applications, you know, those applications that, you know, Peter has shown as examples of Met's work earlier in the mobility pavilion, that, you know, those, you know, really magical moments which don't necessarily rely so much on the actual technology. It's more about the creative application. So I think that's how I would respond to that question of sustainability.
Peter?
Yeah. I think this is a really, really fundamental question. And, you know, I'm not going to lie, it's a very, very difficult one to answer. Because the demands of projects, I mean, I think the world actually, moreover, is effectively a curve that is accelerating, that is increasing and almost becoming vertical in terms of how quickly things are done, how disposable things are. You know, when we design a permanent gallery these days, the general term is that a permanent gallery lasts 10 years maximum. I think even now it's less than that. It can be 5 years as considered a permanent gallery. And I think this is a real challenge that the industry faces, because the acceleration is not just in technology, it's also in attitudes. It's how people interpret information. It's quality standards across projects are constantly changing. So that if you are creating highly bespoke and immersive experiences, they have to change and they have to evolve. So I think it's, well, I mean, what we always say when it comes to technology is that if technology was the answer, what was the question? So there always needs to be a questioning in terms of how appropriate is the use of technology. And I think sustainability comes in terms of life cycle, because we are effectively, we're people that all build things, we make things. Building anything has an impact on the planet. You have to take something to change it to build something. You have to take something out of the planet. So I think what we need to look at is the life cycle of those things that we're building and what value they add to society and what they give back. And this is something that is a very, very tricky issue to address. I mean, we would say that, well, we design exhibitions about climate change and that support funding for charity, and we're doing our bit for sustainability in that way. But I think we need to question ourselves in that, you know, are we doing enough in the things that we're building, the life cycle of those things? Can they work harder in terms of impact on the planet? But also, can they work harder in transforming visitors' and clients' attitudes towards the stories that we're telling and how we're telling them, and how those attitudes are then taken forward in the future? So I think this question is a really, really fundamental and important question. And what I would say is it's a hard one to answer. And what I would also say is that a lot of projects currently probably aren't doing enough to address this issue and how increasingly urgent this is becoming, I would say. But for me, it's about the life cycle of the things that we create is where the answer lives.
Is there any other question in the room? Yeah.
Hi, this is Sanjay from Ipsos. I have a question. How do you approach a temporary exhibition compared to the permanent collections? And the second question is more like, how are you dealing with the challenges brought on by the ongoing pandemic?
Could you repeat the questions for our speakers who are signing in remotely?
Hi, okay, I will repeat the question. My first question was, how do you approach differently a temporary exhibition versus a permanent collection? So do you, how do you like design as well as, you know, the build approaches? And the second question is more relevant to the ongoing pandemic. Like, do you think it's just temporary and it's going to go away like after a couple of months, or do you think it might bring on a permanent changes in your approach towards the design or the build?
Yeah, I can give an answer to that, actually. Again, I think very, very relevant and important questions. I think from our point of view, when approaching a temporary exhibition as opposed to a permanent exhibition, it can, similar to an expo, it's a temporary event, it can make much more of, I suppose, a bold statement about the current zeitgeist. It can be topical, it can reflect visitors' thoughts and opinions of the now, and it can make bold statements about where we are at that precise moment. I also think temporary exhibitions are a very good opportunity to talk about the future, whereas in a permanent exhibition, this is very, very tricky because that thought, that point of view always changes. So I think you can make very, very bold statements. I think physically permanent versus temporary, there needs to be a much more robust approach to a permanent exhibition, particularly when doing interactives and exhibits. They need to be future-proof, they need to be robust for extended use. So I think that's a fundamental issue to consider. But then in temporary exhibitions, you need to think about, okay, if this thing is there for a week or 6 weeks or 6 months, what happens afterwards? Can it travel? Can it break down? Can it be reassembled? Can it be repurposed? Does it have a life cycle beyond its temporary usage? And then what is the impact the impact of that. I think in terms of the pandemic, yeah, again, very, very important point. Personally, I do think there is going to be a permanent legacy from this, and I think there are potential benefits to how we've been forced to very quickly change our attitudes in terms of physical space and places that people visit and how people communicate and how people interpret information. But also, I think museums primarily can be very tactile spaces, and that's something that's been removed. But that, in terms of interactive interfaces, led us down lots of different and interesting paths in terms of people interacting without even knowing. I think Blink, our Blink project's a good example of that, in that there was an intuitive interactive interface, but you didn't touch anything. You literally just walked around and looked at things and interacted without even realizing that you were. This is something that can exist online in a digital landscape, or it can exist in a physical space, but it starts to explore how we can actually interact with intelligent experiences and spaces through technology, but without the need for an actual physical tactile user interface. I also think it's made things a lot more global. It's made communications a lot more global, the pandemic. And I think the advances in communication technology globally can be used in very interesting ways to create forums within cultural experiences. And I think that is definitely something that's going to be a lasting legacy from the pandemic.
Maybe I'll just jump into, after you, Peter, about this question, because it's interesting, especially after the question about sustainability. I think like the sustainability of a museum, like we have the preconception also that museums are about exhibitions or galleries. I think museum is not about, it's not a gallery actually. Like gallery spaces or like exhibition spaces constitute 20% maybe of a whole museum institution. So you can imagine actually that the museum is has a whole cultural life. It's all about working, it's conservation, it's sometimes cinema production, it's libraries, it's restaurants. So it's a whole life actually of functions that are essential despite the pandemic. I think they won't stop. I mean, this is part of the life and spirit of a museum that really has an essential role also as an active player in a city, an active player for a community, for citizens, because it produces culture, it brings people together, it tackles subjects that usually we don't tackle because they're difficult, because they're conflictual. So it's able to talk about, you know, politics. It's able to ask questions through the critical eye of artists that, in a way, play a sideline. So these are essential elements to the living and the development of a society, and I think they do sustain because of the institution of a museum being more than just a white cube or a hall. And the dialogue between the permanent and the temporary exhibition is one that emphasizes actually the role of the museum as a time machine, as a place where you talk about the past, where you really understand the history, you understand where we're coming from through that permanent collection, through the act of accumulating or collecting, basically, and to be able to draw a history on where we are at the moment and question that history through the temporary exhibition that allows constantly a kind of contradiction sometimes to the narrative or the essential narrative that a museum is developing. So the dialogue between both is really a beautiful one, because it always allows you to understand what's the actual stake of that museum, and through the temporary one, you're talking about the future, you're talking about the present, you're like questioning yourself permanently. That's how I see these relationships through designing this complex, let's say, body, which is the museum.
Hello, Naji Hassi, architect. I have a few answers actually to some of the questions that were raised, and I have a question also to the speakers. about the notion of the question of the relation. What is this strength that we feel when you go in a museum from a visitor's perspective? And the remarks that were made about the leadership, whether during the brief it's a collective effort, but then what happens actually in the lifetime of a museum. So the first answer I would like to give back is that this relation is important, but I would like to introduce a notion which is responsibility from the part of every stakeholder at every stage of the museum. So collaborative work is definitely very important, but when this notion of responsibility gets diluted in the, the challenge that museum making raises, it becomes problematic. So I think we can add the word, which is responsibility. The second suggestion I want to make to answer what is the essence of the museum or the idea is, if we as individuals reflect on our, for example, the dream experience, when you wake up in the morning, you had the dream, what is the first idea that you retain? How do you remember a dream? So imagine a visitor going in a museum after a visit of 1 hour, 2 hours, etc. I think we as placemakers or as designers or creatives have to put ourselves again in the shoes of a visitor, or imagine yourself waking in the morning. And by the way, if you want to remember a dream, you don't have to do anything else before recapturing those images or those moments. You don't have to eat, no drink, etc. So it's an idea that I'm suggesting is to really think of the museum experience as a very intensive dream from which we have to retain one strong core idea, and the rest we might forget it. And my last question is to the architects and designers and creative people in the field. How do you manage the politics with the large meaning when they intervene severely in the making of museums? Thank you.
Peter, would you like to take that?
Sure. Yeah, I think your comment about dreams, I think, is a really kind of astute and inspiring, I think comment, and I think that is what it boils down to. In that, how do you remember something? I think that's what we're always trying to do, as certainly as ourselves as experiential and exhibition designers, is how do we plant those seeds that means people remember an experience that they've had, or they remember a fact that we're telling them about history, or they remember something about science, or some kind of piece of information that stays with them. And they can go through an exhibition or a museum and spend 3 hours there, but if they come away even with one thing that they remember, that is a memory that they take forward with them, I think we've done our job. And I think the dream analogy is a really good one, in that when you wake from a dream is always this kind of cacophony of different things and influences, but there are images that resonate and stay with you. And I think as an exhibition designer, we can use lots of tricks. We use sensory tricks and sights and aromas and vibrations and textures and all of these different things. But I think when we connect them with stories, that's when they resonate. I think it's similar in food, in that you have flavors that are sensory triggers back to your childhood. I think interpretation and learning is the same. I remember one exhibit years ago, and it was in a pretty terrible exhibition about the Titanic, I think in Orlando, but it was really, really simple, and it was a box that was full of water, and the water was the temperature of the ocean where the Titanic sank. And you were encouraged to put your hand in the water and feel how cold the water was. And the exhibit simply said to you, see how long you can hold your hand in the water. And it was about, after 2 or 3 seconds, you were like, that's really cold, I need to take my hand away. And, it looked a fright, you know, and it from quality standards, it wasn't a very good exhibit. But what it did is it formed a sensory memory linked with a story. And I must admit, I've never forgotten it. It's something that I always remember, and it was years and years ago. And I think it's trying to create those connections between the physical and the emotional in order to build those memories. Is absolutely fundamental when doing any kind of experiential project in building those memories. And I think to your last point about how we kind of politically manage expectations on projects, or how we kind of negotiate clients. Maybe they're changing needs, or different departments and stakeholders and things like that. I think, again, it comes down to relationships. And ultimately, I think if we're very, very passionate about what we do, and we've done our due diligence in order to justify what we've done, conceptually, technically, but also, you know, emotionally, I guess one could say, you know, we can always have that dialogue. And I think at the same time, we always need to be flexible. There's always a different way of looking at something. You know, we welcome our clients to challenge all of our ideas and our notions. But I think it's incumbent upon us to always justify what we do, but also to clearly communicate what we do as well, so that not only the final product is visible, but the process we've gone through and the justifications as to why we are doing what we are doing and how it is of value is fundamental for us to communicate at each stage. And I think that comes back to the original point about, you know, if someone just said, well, I'm going to do a container of water that you're going to put your hand in, on its own, it's if you propose that as an idea, it's terrible. But if you give the reasons why, then it becomes something of importance. And I think that's kind of a lesson learned in terms of how to create meaningful experiences and communicate them to audiences, but also to stakeholders and clients.
Do we have a very last and quick question in the room? Yeah, Carol, do we have time for one last quick question?
Can I just react
I think we'll have to wrap up because I believe the room is being prepped for the next session of the symposium.
Naji, maybe I can react to his question. First, I think, like, thank you for the description about the dream. I think it really kind of plunges us into the poetics of the museum, but it's like a dream actually that you always come to, because I think one of the successful museums are the ones that allow you to discover their spaces, but also their collection bit by bit. In a way, you go there and you have a first reading and you're able to kind of deepen your knowledge every time you go again. So in a way, it doesn't throw on you all the all the information of the collection or the purpose of it. And I think like there is a lot of political challenge, as you noted, when doing a museum. And one of the key things is to first understand the political time, because it's a completely different time than that of the design, and be in a way able to adapt to that political time. And the second is also understanding what is at stake actually with the politics, and how does museum making fits or not actually within the politics actually that surround it, or the like vision of a political leader. And I think also trying to share together a strong vision of the project, which goes back to the initial red line actually that you talked about in the beginning.
Thank you, Lina. With that, we shall close today's session. Distinguished participants and speakers, it has certainly been a rich and intense discussion over the last hour. And to express my appreciation to all of our audiences who took the floor to challenge and push the boundaries of our experts. This morning, we have heard a lot about brief and definition, adaptability and fluidity, empathy, leadership, evolution, and connections. How do we, as museum professionals, encourage and instill these values among our projects, partners, clients, and visions. What is at stake in creating the museum of the future? What is our role in the renewed appetite of culture? Have they evolved from 24 months ago, or will it remain the same? Or has it changed already? My colleagues at Chargeurs Museum Solutions and France Museums are very grateful for your expressions of support and participation in today's masterclass as the voice of the museum professionals. We have listened attentively to your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions during this formal session, and no doubt, for those who are at the pavilion, you will continue with the interactive dialogues with our experts and fellow participants throughout the day. I believe this will be the first of the many, many occasions where we will come together again to continue exploring the importance of what have been discussed, debated, answered, and challenged today. I sincerely hope we will be able to meet in person in our next session soon. I trust you all have enjoyed the session as much as I have. Once again, our esteemed audiences and speakers, we thank you. And to our partner, France Museums, it's been a privilege to host this masterclass with you. We shall see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you. The symposium will start at 2 p.m. in the same room with 2 round tables to discuss many, many, many subjects in the Museum of the Future. Thank you.